Hi! On the Woodpecker today, I make the table and install it. I've ended my last episode just before cutting the bandsaw table. This table will be made out of 2 layers of plywood. I cut both of them from a sheet of 18mm Baltic birch plywood. Then, with the help of the plan, I mark what I need to remove from the bottom layer. I don't want to mess up, so I identify really clearly what I need to remove and make the first cut. This will be the saw blade curve. Then I finish the hole with the jigsaw. I finish it with a rasp. Now that the glue of the trunnion sides is dry, I can remove the screws and drill big holes over the screws holes. I drill as deep as I can. Then I glue a piece of dowel in each hole. When the glue is dry, I cut the excess and sand them smooth. I just realized that the slot of the trunnion's bolt is too narrow. I need to fix this. On the fixed part, I drill it bigger. Now I can try this. And with the trunnion assembled, I can see that I have a 45-degree angle and a 90 also when I switch position. Now I lay the trunnion and the bottom layer of the table in place just to check if it's okay. Since it is, I can make the hole on the top layer. This hole is far from being finished. It's just big enough to let some clamps pass through. But with that, I can glue both layers together. And just like I showed, I'm using small clamps to clamp the center of the table. Then I put a bunch of clamps around the table. I leave this aside while the glue dries. When it's dry, I can see that both layers are not exactly at the same place. So I cut every side flush. Then I file the top hole to the right size. Next, I can cut a wide groove on the front of the table to the size of a T-track. I'll use this to guide the rib fence I intend to make later. Now with the track in place, I can cut all the corners and I'm ready to glue some formica under the table. I begin by spreading a coat of contact cement on the bottom of the table and on 2 pieces of formica I have lying around. About 15 minutes later, I stick both pieces under the table. With a roller, I apply good pressure everywhere. Then I flip over the table and do the same thing for the top. But this time I use some leftovers from my shop countertop, and I have enough for the whole table. Then I can cut the excess. Next, I drill a hole big enough in the back so my router bit can pass through and remove some formica. I do the same thing for the top. Then I set the router cutting depth to a height of 6 mm, and with a rail I cut a rabbet around the top hole. I take care to place the rail straight, and I use some stops. I do the same thing for the 4 sides. When I'm done, I make the corner square. Then I cut some pieces of plywood to fill the hole. I cut a bunch, so I'll be set for a long time. But even with all the care I took, I still managed to mess up a little. Next, I make a small chamfer around the bottom and top. And finally, I cut the curve for the saw blade. Now I can try the table in place. And do you remember me telling you that my modification will haunt me again? Well, the wheel almost touches the table. What I should have done was to glue a shim under the trunnions base instead. I'll do that right now. I begin by sanding a maple cutoff straight. After cutting it to size, I glue it under the trunnion base. On a metal bandsaw, there's always a pin which keeps the table straight. So I'm going to do something like this for my bandsaw. So I cut a mortise in the center of the saw curve. Next, I use some maple scrap and make a tenon for this. It's done, but it's too difficult to remove. So I drill a hole in one end. Now that the shim's glue is dry, I drill it. After putting this back in place, it's way better. Now I have some space over the wheel. Now I can mark the placement of the movable part of the trunnion on the table. But before even thinking of screwing it in place, I need to drill some holes for the screws. Now I mark the placement of the screws under the table. I mark only one side. Remove the support, check if it's square, and mark the other holes. Then I can drill the pilot holes. And I don't forget to mark where they go. Then I screw them in place. I also screw the guide blocks. When the guide is in place, it's easy to mark the wood I need to remove by hand. After removing some wood, I check my progress and update what still needs to be removed. Eventually it's perfect, and I can tilt the table at 45 degrees. I put that back on the saw, and I can clearly see it's not square to the blade. I need to fix this. So I begin by measuring the thickness of the shim I'll need, cut it, and put it in place. After reassembling it back again, it's perfect. At 90 degrees and also 45. But tightening the nut by hand is getting old. So I cut several wooden knobs. This bandsaw works like a charm. After removing the saw marks, I route a round over around each knob's edges. Then I drill some holes for the nuts. After filing a nut shape, I can press a nut into each knob. Then I remove the patterns paper. If a knob needs a bolt, I put the bolt in place and mark its edge shape directly on the wood. Then I remove a little bit of wood, add epoxy, and drive the bolt in place. The tension crank needs a handle. I just cut a piece of dowel, drill a hole in its center, and screw it in place. Now that I have all the knobs, I can put them in place. At this point, I should do something for my blade guard. So I drill some holes into the middle. Then with a super long drill bit, I drill pilot holes into the guide. Then I screw the guard in place. Now I can start to work on the saw enclosure. But I think I'll only show that in the next episode of the Woodpecker.